Last time we spoke about the final battles to push the Qing forces out of Tonkin. The Qing, Black Flag, and Vietnamese forces were fighting bitterly, on the open field and as guerrillas to kick France out of Tonkin. The guerrilla activity led to bloody months at the isolated outposts of Tai Nguyen, Hung Hoa, and Tuyên Quang. To dislodge the Qing army from Tonkin, the French attacked them at Nui Bap and seized Langson, thus saving the outposts from being taken. After securing their outposts, the French recommenced their offensive, attacking Hoa Mont. But the Qing and Black Flag forces erected a siege at Tuyên Quang, to which the French beat them again. Then at Dang Dung, the French finally pushed the Qing forces across the Gate of China, back to their homeland. The war over Tonkin was fierce, costing countless lives, and all for a war that was never officially declared. But was it won and done? Well, we are about to find out. This episode is the Sino-French War, Part 4, of War and Peace. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there, I'm just now releasing a historic film review of the film Grave of the Fireflies, a real tearjerker. Also, just a friendly reminder, I now myself have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And this month's exclusive podcast over there is part 2 on my series about General Ishiwara Kanji, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident and the man who created the Final War theory. Check it out, it would mean a lot to me. General François Oscar took his 2nd Brigade and absolutely smashed the remnants of the Guangxi Army at Dang Dung, sending them fleeing back to their homeland. And I have to correct myself. In 2 previous episodes, I believe I said that Dang Dung was said a different way. This is embarrassing, but when it comes to having to pronounce things in other languages that I don't speak, I usually rely on Google Translate's function where it reads it out to you, and an accent came up that wasn't supposed to be there in the official way that you spell Dang Dung. So yeah, it is Dang Dung, and Google Translate was just giving me gibberish. So yeah, I was wrong. I'm a moron. Sorry about that. We'll carry on. For good measure, the French literally blew up the Gate of China, also known today as the Gate of Friendship, which was the border between Guangxi and Tonkin. The customs building, walls, gate itself, it was all blown up sky high. Once this was done, the 2nd Brigade pulled back to Langson at the end of February of 1885. Thus by March, the Guangxi Army had been pushed out of Tonkin by General Oscar, while the Yunnan Army had been defeated heavily at Tuyên Quang and Huang Hoa by the 1st Brigade of Giovanninelli. Despite the sweeping victories, the Qing were not truly defeated by any means. They still held considerable forces across the border. General Brière de Lille thought about launching an offensive against the nearest target within China, such as the military depot at Langzhou, but did not have enough men to really pull it off. He had to wait for reinforcements. Reinforcements would arrive in mid-March. He sat down with his officers and devised a course of action. It was agreed the 1st Brigade would attack the Yunnan Army to push them beyond the Yanbei, while the 2nd Brigade would hold its position at Langson. The Guangxi Army, in the meantime, was rebuilding its strength and by March the 17th had been bolstered to 30,000 men. Soon the Guangxi Army would be pressing upon the Tonkin border with 2 major camps at Yinquai and Bangbo, with over 9 separate military commands. Behind Yinquai, in the village of Mofu, 2 to 3 kilometers, were another 7,000 men led by Generals Su Yuanchuan and Chen Xia. Another 15 kilometers behind Mofu was the village of Pingxiang, with another 7,000 men led by General Jiang Songhan, and Fang Yusheng. 50 kilometers to the west at Aiwa village was 3,500 men led by Commander Wei Gang. 15 kilometers east at Kuai, sitting at the toehold within Tonkin, was 3,500 men led by General Wang Dubang. An overall command of the Guangxi Army was in the hands of General Pan Dixin, who was at Huaicun, over 30 kilometers behind Mufu village with 3,500 men. General Oscar had around 1,600 men to hold Langson, so it was not looking so good for the French boys. On March the 22nd, Feng Xucai led a raid against the French outpost at Dongdang. That said outpost was held by forces under Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Gustave Hambiguel, someone we spoke a tiny bit about in a previous battle, who made the rather idiotic decision to outflank the enemy by going way too far around, so far so that his superior simply sent another force to attack the enemy. Hambiguel's French Foreign Legionnaires fought off the raid once the rest of the 2nd Brigade came up to support his outpost defenses. Upon driving off the raiders, General Oscar decided it was a good idea to strike back. He hoped to take the enemy by surprise, and he led the men to cross over to the Jianyangguan Pass, which held the Guangxi encampment at Bangbo. Oscar did not intend for a major offensive against the Guangxi province. His simple aim was to raid them back and give some breathing room for Dongdang. Oscar left a single company of the 2nd African Battalion with some batteries to hold Langson, and his 23rd Battalion to hold Dongdang, which would act as his supply line to his main body marching for Jianyangguan. On March the 23rd, 1,600 men with 10 artillery pieces made their way. The next day, the French were met with fierce resistance when they approached Jianyangguan. There they found the Guangxi Army utilizing outwork fortifications. Along with the defense, Wang Dubang sent his forces from Kuai to launch a counterattack hitting the French right flank. Oscar's men were able to repel the counterattack and seize the outworks, and the next day he had his men launch an attack against the enemy's main position at Bangbo. He planned to hit the front while simultaneously sending men to sweep around the rear. The frontal defensive line of Bangbo held a long trench line which the French named the Long Trench. To attack the front, Oscar sent the 111th Battalion, led by Chef du Bataillon, François Léonfort, and for the rear attack, the 2nd Legion Battalion, led by Chef du Bataillon Ziguet, and the 143rd Battalion of Chef du Bataillon Ferret. Hambiguel was leading the 3rd Regiment when he was ordered to guide Duget and Ferret to perform their rear attack maneuver. Unfortunately, a thick fog hit the area, causing Hambiguel to get lost. This was the 2nd time this has happened to this guy, by the way. Oscar, unaware of Hambiguel's plight, mistook a Guangxi Army column moving towards the Long Trench to be Hambiguel's 2nd Battalions and promptly ordered Fer to launch his frontal attack. Fer's 111th formed their line and charged into the fray. They immediately came under intense fire from Feng Xucai's infantry manning the Long Trench and other Guangxi units manning nearby hills. Within seconds, several officers were killed. 2 companies made it to the trench after a very short hand-to-hand fighting match, which saw them fleeing from a major counterattack led personally by Feng Xucai. The carnage was intense. And what actually saved countless fleeing French was the Guangxi Army's resolve to behead the wounded French and plunder their arms. Meanwhile, to the right of the battlefield, Ferret's 143rd Battalion and Duget's 2nd Legionnaires leapt into the fray of battle, several hours longer than expected. They quickly seized the Qing-held fort. At 3 p.m., Pang Dixien was watching the 111th Battalion flee for their lives when he saw Hambiguel's command and tossed a counterattack their way. Hambiguel's command was nearly encircled. In fact, a single company of the 143rd Battalion, led by an Irish officer, Captain Patrick Cotter, were completely encircled. Hambiguel ordered the men to retreat, and he left Captain Patrick's company behind. But the French Foreign Legionnaires ignored the order, and they charged at the Qing to break free the company. Despite the company being able to break free, Captain Patrick was killed in action. Gradually, Duget and Ferret's men fell back, performing a fighting withdrawal to keep the Qing onslaught at bay as best as they could. During the chaos, the 3rd Legion Battalion of Lieutenant Colonel Schoeffer had been ordered to stay on Tonkinese soil around Dangdong to protect their flanks, and they found themselves fighting desperately to keep a line of retreat for the incoming French. Schoeffer's men had to fight off both flanks, enabling the rest of the army to fight their way back through the middle. General Oscar was leading the rearguard to try and maintain morale, and he was successful at stopping a complete rout of his forces. Oscar spent the majority of the late afternoon quelling disorder amongst differing commands, trying to keep the men simply together. The entire brigade's morale was dropping as their ammunition did so likewise, so Oscar called for a general retreat back to Langson. On the night of March 24th, they camped at Dong Dang, exhausted and shell-shocked. Sergeant Moret of Duguet's 2nd Legionnaires had this to say about the feelings of the men. The night was dark. The soldiers marched in complete silence. We felt cheated, ashamed and angry. We were leaving behind us both victory and many of our friends. From time to time, in low murmurs, we established who was missing. Then we relapsed into silence of mourning and the bitterness of loss. And so we reached Dong Dang, without being disturbed. We slept in the field hospital huts, after drinking some soup. We were harassed and hungry. We had not eaten all day, and had drunk nothing since the morning, except a single cup of coffee. In spite of my weariness, I spent a troubled night. My spirits were haunted by the day's memories, by images of the fighting and the phantoms of our misfortunes. I was shaken with spasms. I trembled as I have never done on the battlefield. I lay down, but was unable to sleep. The French had suffered 74 deaths, 213 wounded, and amongst the dead were 7 officers. They estimated the Qing casualties to be around 1,650, which are definitely inflated numbers, by the way. The defeat shocked France, who was becoming accustomed to victory reports. Oscar kept the men marching back to Langson, as their coolies had all abandoned them, creating a severe supply issue. The Guangxi Army pursued them the entire way, leading to another battle at Kailua on March 28th. This time the French had rested up a bit, and they took up defensive positions behind some earthworks. The rationale for the battle was to hold on to the road to Langson for as long as possible, and they managed to repel an intense attack from the enemy. The French saw 7 deaths with 38 wounded, but inflicted severe casualties upon the pursuing enemy. The French claimed to have seen over 1,200 corpses scattered around the battlefield and perhaps wounded another 6,000 Guangxi soldiers, if anyone would believe those numbers, which they should not. For those of you who have been listening to this series all the way back to the first Opium War episodes, as I had said then, the primary sources are from British officers, and the numbers they give are just ridiculous. It's unbelievably inflated. But I gotta say this. The French, it seems, are so much worse than the British when it comes to inflating these numbers. Because the sources I've been reading for this series, my God, this is just impossible. If you ever want a good laugh, just look up the Sino-French War of 1884 to 1885 on Wikipedia, and just go through the campaigns, and just look at the casualty lists. It is ridiculous. Anyways, we'll carry on. Towards the end of the carnage, Oscar was severely wounded in the chest while helping his scouts find Qing positions. He was forced to hand command over to the most senior officer, who unfortunately was Miguel. At this point, many officers had commented on his lackluster performance during the undeclared war. He had seriously messed up on quite some occasions. Well, it seems Miguel began his command in a rather panicked state. For despite the fact they had just battered the Qing pursuers, he was convinced they were going to encircle the brigade at any moment. Against the vast majority of his officers' protest, he ordered the 2nd Brigade to abandon Langson on that very night that he took command. They were to retreat to Chu, and initially they were divided, marching into 2 columns, with Miguel's going towards Dangmois and Schoeffer's going to Dongsong. Miguel began to fear the men towing the artillery would slow down his retreat, so he ordered the artillery pieces tossed into the Song-Ki-Kong River alongside the brigade's treasure chest. Yeah. At the very same time, Miguel sent a runner over to Brière de Lille over in Hanoi, claiming he did not have enough ammunition to fight a second battle for Langson, and that he was retreating. His claim of not having enough ammunition would later prove to be incorrect. Both He Bega and Chauffeur forced an intense pace for their marches, and by the time the men reached Thanh Moi and Dong Song, they were exhausted. Brea de Lille, upon receiving the message from He Bega, was shocked he abandoned Langson. This prompted him to send word back to Paris about the entire ordeal. The next day, Brea de Lille sent a message over to He Bega demanding he hold his position at Thanh Moi and Dong Song. He Bega thought this was insane, but he obeyed the orders nonetheless. On the 30th, the French prepared their defenses at Thanh Moi and Dong Song. He Bega tossed some cavalry patrols to figure out exactly where the Guangxi army might hit them from, and they came back with reports that they were heading down the Mandarin Road south of Langson. He Bega sent word to Brea de Lille stating he believed the enemy would soon encircle them. The French defenders were told by He Bega to fasten their bayonets and to hunker down. Now it seems He Bega's nerves were completely shot, because on the night of the 30th, he told his fellow officers he believed that they were all going to be massacred the following morning. He went to bed at 8 p.m., and an hour later he began hearing some firing from the forward positions. It would turn out to be a false alarm, but one officer rushed over to He Bega to wake him up and reported the action, to which He Bega allegedly yelled out, "I'm sick, and the column is just as sick as me. Leave me alone." Meanwhile, Brea de Lille was receiving He Bega's panicked reports throughout the night, and he reluctantly gave He Bega permission to retreat back to Thieu at 10 p.m. if, in his words, quote, "if the situation demanded it." Well, that was more than enough for He Bega, who immediately ordered a retreat to Thieu that very night. He Bega's message back to Brea de Lille read this: "I will take advantage of the night and the moon to retire, in conformity with your instructions." And so the men packed up and began their trek from Thanh Moi and Dong Song, linking up along the way. Chauffeur's force was attacked by some Qing patrols, but it did not amount to too much. He Bega yet again ordered artillery pieces to be spiked and abandoned, believing they would slow down his column. However, the gunnery officers actually just disobeyed his orders and kept carrying the pieces all the way safely to Thieu. Good on them. At dawn on the 31st, the Guangxi army caught up to the French near the village of Pho Cam, just as He Bega received reinforcements, a squadron of Spahi cavalry. Upon seeing the cavalry, the French officers and soldiers rejoiced, seeking to direct them to charge right into the forward positions of the Guangxi army patrols to break them down a bit. But He Bega forbid this charge, and instead ordered them to retreat at the same pace. Now, while He Bega thought the entire Guangxi army was coming after him, this was not actually the case. Back on the 29th, the bulk of the Guangxi army was actually retreating back towards Jinnanguan. That was until some Vietnamese caught up to them, giving them reports the French were shockingly abandoning Langson and in full retreat. General Pan Ding-Xing could not believe it. He had immediately ordered his battered army to turn around to seize Langson. Once Langson had been taken, he sent out smaller forces to skirmish with the retreating French, to prod them along the way, because the reality was his army was in really no condition to fully attack them. When he received word his skirmishers were hitting the French around Pho Cam, he ordered his main body to occupy Dong Song and Bac Le, knowing that they were undefended. Thus, He Bega had unknowingly lost everything gained during the last offensive to kick the Guangxi army out of Tonkin. On April the 1st, the 2nd Brigade finally got to Thieu, exhausted and bitterly demoralized. Brea de Lille had ordered the 1st Brigade to depart Honghua for Thieu and told Colonel Gustave Boigny-Desbordes to take command of the 2nd Brigade. On the 2nd of April, Colonel Desbordes relieved He Bega of his command and issued the following order to the entire 2nd Brigade. In view of General Oscar's serious wound, I have been asked to take provisional command of the brigade. I have arrived with fresh troops and ammunition. I have been told by the General-in-Chief that there is to be no further retreat. We are to remain here at all costs, and that is precisely what we shall do. Minecraft oomph sounds. Now the 1st Brigade had not sat by idly with all the chaos and disorder befalling upon the 2nd Brigade. Back on March the 23rd, the 1st Battalion, led by Chef de Bataillon Simon, was ordered to depart from Honghua to perform a preliminary reconnaissance of the village of Phu Lam Tao. The reason for this was because the French had been receiving reports that the Black Flags, along with remnants of the Yunnan Army, had been occupying it. Simon and his men went to the village, discovering the reports to be true. Simon then ordered his men to attack, and disaster struck. According to Lieutenant Colonel Bonifaci, the troops quickly fell into disorder, tossing their equipment down, including rifles, and they fled the scene. A military report of the operation indicated 400 uniforms and large quantities of arms were abandoned. The French suffered around 50 casualties. Now, while this is by no means a large engagement, nor that significant of a defeat, in combination with the disastrous Langson retreat, it would lead to a devastating effect for France. The situation these two combined events created is known as the Tonkin affair. Bria de Lille, while in Hanoi, had begun planning to move his HQ over to Honghua, where he further planned to launch an offensive against the Yunnan Army, believing it to be still operating around Tuan Quang. However, the disastrous retreat of Hambiguer combined with the defeat of Simon's force, this led Bria de Lille to believe that the entire Red River Delta region was threatened now, and he sent a fateful telegram under duress, which made its way to the French government on the 28th. Here is what the Langson telegram said. I am grieved to tell you that General Oscar is seriously wounded and the Langson has been evacuated. The Chinese forces advanced in 3 large groups and fiercely assaulted our positions in front of Kuela. Facing greatly superior numbers, short of ammunition, and exhausted from a series of earlier actions, Colonel Hambiguer had informed me that the position was untenable and that he had been forced to fall back tonight on Dongsong and Tan Moi. All my efforts are being applied to concentrate our forces at the passes around Chu and Kip. The enemy continues to grow stronger in the Red River, and it appears that we are facing an entire Chinese army, trained in the European style and ready to pursue a concerted plan. I hope in any event to be able to hold the entire Delta against this invasion, but I consider that the government must send me reinforcements, men, ammunition, and pack animals as quickly as possible. The telegram created a political crisis. The stock market plunged, and many called for Jules Ferre's government to resign. Ferre dove into a heated debate calling for the need to avenge the loss at Langson and to secure France's hold over Tonkin. To do this, Ferre demanded 200 million francs to be handed over to the army and navy, which met a bitter rebuttal from Georges Clemenceau, who absolutely tore Ferre for everything. Here is a bit of his speech. We're completely finished with you. We're never going to listen to you again. We're not going to debate the nation's affairs with you again. We no longer recognize you. We don't want to recognize you. You're no longer ministers. You all stand accused of high treason. And if the principles of accountability and justice still exist in France, the law will soon give you what you deserve. And so a motion of no confidence was immediately tabled, and Ferre was voted down 306 to 149. Ferre left in absolute disgrace, as all of Paris blew up, blaming him for what became infamously known as the Tonkin affair. The humiliating blow saw Henri Brissot become the prime minister, who started his premiership by trying to negotiate a peace with the Ching Dynasty. Meanwhile, back over in Formosa, the French were still effectively blockading its northern territory. The war in Formosa had been quieted down somewhat. Liu Mingchuan, as you might recall, received some reinforcements in the form of the Anhui and Xiang army units. By April of 1885, he had around 35,000 men. They were also armed with more modern firearms, such as the Lee Model 1879 rifle, Winchesters, Remingtons, and Mausers. The French considered these forces to be the very cream of the Qing military, well-dressed, well-armed, and noticeably tall and sturdy. Liu Mingchuan did not stop there. He began hiring more local Hakka militiamen and headhunting Formosan aborigines. Just a little side note, those Formosan aborigines, since I am a specialist in the Pacific War, they end up helping the Japanese during the Pacific War, and they were terrifying. Yeah, the Japanese actually really respected them, which is unusual for the Japanese in that time period, as they were Well, to be frank, very racist. On the other side, the Formosa Expeditionary Corps had also been bolstered, now 4,000 men strong, led by Lieutenant Colonel Jac Duan, who had gained quite a lot of fame serving a major defeat to Liao Yongfu's Black Flag Army at the Battle of Uoc. The two opposing forces skirmished quite often, until January of 1885 when a real offensive began. Duchesne ordered his men to seize Ya Mei Shan, known as La Table to the French. The offensive started out rough due to the terrible torrential rain. The French and Qing forces fought for days at a place known as Fork Y, but in the end, Duchesne's men were able to push the Qing out of the way and they continued to march upon La Table. By February, La Table was seized, and the Qing forces bombarded their position by mid-February until the French silenced their artillery using their own. In March, Duchesne launched a second offensive, successfully breaking the Qing encirclement of Kulung, delivering an outstanding outflanking maneuver in the process. Duchesne's men pushed the Qing past the Kulung River, losing 41 men dead and 157 wounded, while estimating that they inflicted up to 1,500 casualties upon the enemy, which, again, are pretty ridiculous numbers that should be questioned. The French seized numerous forts the Qing had built up around Kulung at a place called Shiqiling, Huangtanshan, and Yumeishan. The French renamed them La Dent, Fort Bamboo, and Fort La Table, as we had mentioned before. It was an incredible French victory given the odds, but these feats were done at the exact same time as the famous siege of Tonkin, and thus remain largely unknown to the French public. Alongside this, Duchesne's victories enabled Admiral Courbet to follow them up by landing Marine forces from the Kulung garrison to capture the Pescador Islands in late March. Controlling the Pescador Islands allowed the French to thwart Qing reinforcements of Formosa. Thus, France was gradually consolidating its control over the entire island. But this also came right smack dab in the middle of the Langson retreat's disaster. Admiral Courbet almost had to evacuate Kulung to take his forces over to Tonkin to try and save that situation. But peace talks had begun before he could do so. Now, I don't know about all of you guys, but other than Kings and Generals, of course, my favorite channel on YouTube is actually Alternate History Hub. Can't help it, I love Cody's work. So I want to, just point this out there. Imagine things went different here. Imagine France took control of Taiwan. What would happen in alternate history? There's a lot of variables at play. I just find it kind of interesting that France really almost had Formosa. It would have completely shifted so many more events because during what's going to be for the next 50 years, there's kind of a scramble to control a lot of the eastern parts of China, particularly between Britain and Russia. But France was never a huge player in all that. They always kept to the south. But if they controlled the whole island Formosa, that would have been interesting. Anyways, so things were not going too well for France. The French public were losing their minds over the Tonkin debacle, and it was forcing them to the peace table. However, things were going wildly worse for the Qing Dynasty. Because if you can remember way back when, before we even began with this little French adventure, the Qing were having some troubles with Japan over in Korea. The Gafsen coup had occurred in December of 1884, drawing the Qing attention towards the threat of Japan. Things in Korea were beginning to get much worse, and to be honest, as grand a success as the Hamburger debacle had delivered the Qing during the disastrous retreat, in truth, the Guangxi army was decimated by the war. Yes, they grabbed their positions back within Tonkin, but holding them was another matter entirely. To add to their misery, it looked like they were going to lose Formosa. Thus, Empress Dowager Cixi ordered the Qing envoys to go immediately to the peace table. The Qing sent Li Hongjiang to meet with Jules Patrenat, and they opened up by agreeing to the provisions of the Tientsin Accord. The French would get their protectorate over Vietnam, but they were to drop the long-standing demands of reparations for the Bac Le ambush. Negotiations carried on into April of 1885, where they finally agreed to a preliminary peace protocol and an immediate ceasefire in Tonkin and Formosa. The French agreed to lift their rice blockade, and the Qing finally agreed to pull out the Yunnan and Guangxi armies from Tonkin with an official deadline stated for May of 1885. The Qing also made sure to pressure Li Yongfu and his Black Flag Army to withdraw from Tonkin so that they did not screw up the entire peace deal. By June of 1885, the new Tientsin Accord was signed. A byproduct of this war was the absolute destruction of a capable Vietnamese resistance movement. France had added Tonkin and Annam to their holding of Cochin China, and they would seize Cambodia by 1887, thus creating what we know as French Indochina. By 1893, Laos would also be added after the Franco-Siamese War, thus creating a very large French Far East colonial empire. It would not be until the Pacific War whereupon France would lose its iron control over Southeast Asia. I would like to take this time to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I am soon to release an episode actually in French for once on France's role during the Pacific War. Don't worry, there will be subtitles. Also, just a friendly reminder, I now myself have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. This month's exclusive podcast episode is part 2 on my series about General Ishiwara Kanji, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident and the guy who created the theory of the final war. Please check it out, it would mean a lot to me. And so France had won an undeclared war over the Ching Dynasty, and in the process would control a large portion of Southeast Asia, known henceforth as French Indochina. The Qing had been dealt yet again another humiliating blow.